Today we're going to talk about externalities, and we'll start with some simple theory. So the theory of externalities. Now, as I've said before, the sort of fundamental mantra of most of this course is that markets know best. Indeed, as I said, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, that powerful sounding name, is the conclusion that the perfectly competitive private market will deliver the welfare maximizing outcome. So standard economics starts from the proposition the market knows best. In that world, the government can only screw things up. Okay, all the government does is sort of mess up the first best. Now, either, despite this, the government is, in the typical developed economy, at least typically 25 to 30% of the economy is the government. So either these developed economies have it totally wrong, or there are some reasons why we might actually depart from the standard 1401 model and think for reasons for government. Now, we didn't cover one, which was imperfect competition. We talked about it in perfectly competitive markets, government policy can make things better. What I'll do in the next two lectures is talk about two other kinds of rationale. Oh, I'm sorry. So for government rationale, we talked about imperfect competition, and obviously it's redistribution is another rationale for government. We talked about that last time too. If we think that social welfare is increased by redistributing from rich to poor despite some leak. So we've covered two roles. There's fixing imperfect markets, and there's redistribution. In the next two lectures, we'll talk about two other roles for government. And if this whets your appetite, you want to learn more, you can take 1441, which is, of course, all about public policy. You can learn a lot more. But we'll talk about two other reasons. Today, we're going to talk about externalities, which is another justification for government involvement. And we're going to dive right in with an example. So what's an externality? An externality occurs whenever the actions of one party impact another party in a way for which the first party does not receive the costs and benefits. So if my actions impact you, but I don't bear the costs if they're negative actions or the benefits if they're positive actions, then that's an externality. So anytime one party's actions affect another party, but the first party does not receive either the costs or the benefits of that impact, that's an externality. Let's start with the standard theory example. Okay, the standard example we always teach externalities is the example of the steel plant dumping sludge in a river. So imagine somewhere in America, there's a steel plant located on a river, and they produce steel. And the production process has a certain production function, and one feature of this production function is for every unit of steel produced, a unit of sludge, a unit of waste is produced. And the steel plant dumps that into the river. So just given the nature of their production process, 1 unit of steel equals 1 unit of sludge is dumped in the river. Now, let's imagine that down this river there's a set of fishermen. And these fishermen make their living fishing in the river. And that when the steel plant dumps sludge in the river, it flows down the river and kills their fish, kills some of their fish. Okay? Now, this is a classic example of what we call a negative production externality. It's production in the sense it's coming from the supply side. It's coming from the production of the steel. It's producing this externality. It's negative because it's negatively impacting the fishermen down the stream. And it's an externality because the steel plant doesn't give a shit. Okay? They dump their sludge, it goes down and it kills some fish, and they care. But they don't bear the cost of doing so. The fishermen bear the cost of doing so. It's externality because the plant dumps the sludge, but it's the fishermen who bear the consequences. It's a classic negative production externality. Negative because it's bad, production because it comes from the supply side, externality because the costs are borne by another party, not by the party doing the activity. Graphically, we can analyze that in something like figure 23.1. This is the classic externality diagram. Here we have the market for steel. We look at the market for steel because it's the production of steel that generates this negative externality. So we look at the market for steel. You've got a quantity of steel being produced and a price of steel. Standard market. You've got a supply curve and a demand curve. So in our analysis to date, and let's say it's perfectly competitive, our analysis to date would say where supply equals demand is at point A with a quantity Q1 and a price P1, and we would say that is the welfare maximizing outcome. Perfectly competitive market. Okay? What this misses, however, is that the supply curve X is the private marginal cost. That's the cost of the machines and the building and the workers that make the steel. But we as a society don't just care about the private cost, we care about the social cost. We care about the fact that as a think of a society with a social welfare function, that social welfare function incorporates both the steel plant and the fishermen. So we don't just care about the steel plant's costs, the machines and the workers. We care about the cost of the fishermen too. We care about social marginal costs. What are social marginal costs? That is private marginal costs plus the damage done through the negative externality. And what we're going to do is we should assume that's $100 per unit of steel produced. We're just making that up. We're just going to assume that every steel unit produced delivers $100 in negative externality in terms of fish killed downstream. Now, that does not have to, I've assumed it's constant, doesn't have to be constant. You can imagine a little sludge doesn't do much damage. More sludge does more damage. That would be a nonlinear curve that wouldn't shift up constantly. But to make life easy, imagine sort of in this region, every unit of steel produces a unit of sludge that kills $100 worth of fish. Okay, so and meanwhile, now on the other hand, the demand curve, so the supply curve is the private marginal cost. The demand curve is the private marginal benefit. But in this case, that is the same as the social marginal benefit because there's no externalities from the consumption of steel. We'll come back in a minute to consumption externalities, but let's assume for a minute that like my private benefit from consuming steel is society's benefit from consuming steel. It's not like by consuming steel, I create some positive or negative externality. Okay? So the demand curve is both the private and social marginal benefit. But the private marginal cost is below the social marginal cost. The social marginal cost, the private marginal cost, plus the externality damage. Now, what does this mean? This means that the optimal level of production from society's perspective is not point A, it's point C. From society's perspective, incorporating the damage to the fishermen along with the cost of the steel plant, then the optimal point is where those social marginal costs equal social marginal benefit, which is point C. So from society's perspective, there should be less steel production, okay, at an amount Q2, which is below Q1. But the steel plant doesn't care. The steel plant produces Q1. They don't care about the fishermen downstream. So you're going to put overproduction and a dead weight loss. Now, here's the key thing about dead weight loss. We talked about dead weight loss before, but here's the new trick of dead weight loss. Dead weight loss is always drawn with reference to social marginal benefit and cost curves, not private. So dead weight loss is relative to what's best for society, not what's best for one particular actor in society. So the dead weight loss is all the units between Q2 and Q1 where the social marginal cost exceeds the social marginal benefit. So for that first unit to the right of Q2, there's this tiny dead weight loss. But as you move further and farther from Q2 to Q1, the dead weight loss grows because those are units where there's a bigger and bigger gap between the social marginal cost and the social marginal benefit. The bottom line is, going back to the chain of logic, the private steel plant does what's privately optimal. That's where its private marginal cost equals the private marginal benefit. That's at point A. From a social perspective, we care about social marginal cost and social marginal benefit. Social marginal benefit is the same as private marginal benefit in this example. But social marginal cost includes the cost of the fishermen, so it's higher. Given that it's higher, we'd socially optimally produce less steel. Okay? And therefore, we would want less production steel. Now, once again, there's a lot of complications here. For example, what if we, instead of producing less steel, we just stop them from polluting? Well, that would be another answer. You know, there's lots of complications here, but for now, just assume this is the way the production function works. If you're going to make steel, you're going to pollute. Okay? So that's the outcome. That's what we call that's how we think about a negative production externality. Now, externalities can also happen on the consumption side. And the classic example of negative consumption externality is smoking. So let's go to figure 23.2. Now we have the market for cigarettes. There's the quantity of cigarettes on the x-axis, the price of cigarettes on the y-axis. Now, here, we're going to assume private marginal cost curve is equal to social marginal cost curve. That is, there's no, maybe when they make tobacco cigarettes, they pollute, but we'll ignore that for now. Okay, we're just going to assume that there's no pollution from the production side. But on the consumption side, when I smoke a cigarette, I do damage to other people. Okay? Most pernicious, most obviously through secondhand smoke. I'm very sensitive to this right now because my wife's mom smoked 3 packs a day. My wife now has COPD, coronary obstructive pulmonary disease, and was just in the hospital with pneumonia because her mom smoked 3 packs a day. And so her lungs are weak. So this is the example of a negative consumption externality. Her mom smoked and smoked to the point of point A, where her private benefits equal to private costs. But the social costs include my wife, I like to think, and therefore the benefits include the negative impacts on my wife. So this led my wife's mom to over-smoke, or in general, people over-smoke, because they don't account for the fact that there's damage on others. Therefore, there is too much smoking. Too much smoking because it doesn't account for the damage on others. But in this case, this is not a change in supply curve, it's a reduction in the benefits. Because the production of cigarettes hasn't changed. It's just the value of consuming cigarettes has changed. Cigarettes are less valuable to consume because you get the enjoyment from smoking, at least some people think it's enjoyable, but offsetting that is the damage you're doing to others. So that's the shift downward of the marginal benefit curve. Now the social marginal benefit is below the private marginal benefit. And the new equilibrium is where the social marginal benefit equals the social marginal cost. Okay? And therefore, the optimal level of smoking is lower than what individuals would privately choose. Yeah.
You get the marginal at the end, because you're still causing harm to the individual.
Yeah. So that's a very this is not this. I'm going to come back to what happens when you depart. We're assuming perfectly rational people with perfect information. I'll come back to this gets more complicated with perfect information. This is a perfectly rational person with perfect information, even before they knew it. I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm not saying smokers are bad people. Because they're doing what's privately optimal. There's nothing bad about doing what's privately optimal. So it doesn't matter if they knew or not. The point is they're doing damage. From a social perspective, there's too much smoking. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Where does 40 cents come from? Okay, so 40 cents per pack is actually an empirical estimate of the external cost of external damage done by smoking. So it's actually quite interesting. Okay, so basically now this is without secondhand smoke. This is, think about the externalities of smoking. So for example, you get sick and your medical costs are higher. Actually, a huge external cost is smokers start a lot of fires. Thousands of people die every year in America in fires started by smokers. That's an external cost because other people die in the fire department, things like that. Smokers are less productive, so firms make less money because they have to take smoke breaks and things like that. You add all that up, and you get 40 cents a pack. Now, that's without secondhand smoke. The problem with secondhand smoke is we don't know how big that effect is. The estimates are somewhere between a cent a pack and $2 a pack. So it's just really, really hard to measure. And it's really hard to measure partly because of a really interesting phenomenon, which is you might have come back to me and said, wait a second, what happened to your wife is not an externality. Why would under what situation, here's a hard question, under what set of assumptions would the damage done to my wife by her mom smoking not be an externality? Let's say her mom was still alive, but she was in the hospital. Yeah. Exactly. It's only external if her mom doesn't bear the cost, but if her mom knew that by smoking, this is where the information comes in, knew that by smoking she'd make her daughter sick, and chose to smoke anyway, then it's not an externality. In that case, in the marginal benefits for the mom would be included the damage done to the daughter. So what's really interesting, externalities is not a strictly easy thing to measure. It depends on, now, the fisherman doesn't sludge down the river, that's different. But here, the externality is only true if the mom didn't account. So the key question we have to ask economics is, do families maximize a family utility function or an individual utility function? If her mom was maximizing her individual utility, I'm sorry to rag on my mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, but it's just a good example. If she was just focusing on her individual utility, then she should just consider the benefits of her smoking versus the cost of a pack of cigarettes. But if she was maximizing family utility, she can take the benefits of her smoking minus the damage she does to her daughter versus the cost of a pack of cigarettes. Yeah. Well, no, but you're assuming a family utility function. That's what I mean by family utility function. I mean, you care about people in your family. Now, basically, the interesting question is, in other words, it's just about weights. Let's say on one extreme, a person utility function, I don't care about anyone in my family. A full family utility function, I treat them as if they're myself. I care about the utilities with the mind. Where do people lie in between? Now, in fact, there's some evidence on this. And the evidence is basically that women care about their families and men don't. So there's actually a number of studies in developing countries. There's a cool way to test this. And the way you test this is you say, if family utility maximization holds, then it shouldn't matter who controls the resources in the family. If I take $1 from a wife and give it to a husband, that shouldn't change anything, because we're both maximizing the same family utility function. But if there's individual utility functions, then who controls the resources will determine how the money gets spent. And there was quite a striking example from the UK, where they had a tax break for children. And it used to be what happened, this is back in the 70s, it used to be that what happened was, for every child in the household, at the end of the year, a check got sent to the house. Okay? Well, typically women were home and controlled the money in the house. So the women got that check. They then changed the law and said, no, instead we're just going to let take-home pay be a bit higher. So instead of saying check each year, each week will include in your take-home pay. Well, the take-home pay went to the men. Men were working, women weren't. So it shifted from women controlling the money to men controlling the money. And what they found was this shift led to much less being spent on children's clothes and books and much more being spent on alcohol and tobacco, which is inconsistent with a family utility function, consistent with men caring less about their kids than women. Okay? So the bottom line is, we don't have a perfect family utility function. Probably we don't have a perfectly individual utility function either. Probably people care somewhat about their family. But as long as it's not a perfectly family utility function, then there's some externality on family members who secondhand smoke. So 40 cents is clearly too low. We just don't know how low. Okay? Now, externalities don't have to just be negative. They can also be positive. Okay? Let's think about a positive consumption externality. And let's come to one of my favorite people I like throwing shade to, which is my neighbor. Okay? I don't get along with my neighbor at all. And basically, part of the reason I don't get along with my neighbor is because my neighbor has a tendency to start massive landscaping projects and then leave them half done and just not do anything for 10 years. And it's unattractive. And so basically, let's imagine that my neighbor is looking at outside his yard and thinking about the landscape. And he's thinking, what's it worth to me to fix this dirt pile in my yard? Which is now finally, after 20 years, fading away, but was there for about 20 years. What's it worth to me to fix this dirt pile in my yard? Okay. Well, imagine that the dirt pile will cost $1,000 to call away. But he only gets $800 of dish utility from looking at it. So let's say I get $500 of dish utility from looking at it. And let's say, as is clearly true, he doesn't care about me. Then he'll say privately, I should remove the dirt pile. My benefit from doing so is $800. My cost of doing so is $1,000. Okay? So the cost is the benefit, I don't do it. But socially, he should get rid of the dirt pile, because the benefit to society is the $800 to him and the $500 to me. So if you remove the dirt pile, there would be a positive externality. For him consuming landscaping services, there'd be a positive externality, which is my improved view. So there'd be a positive consumption externality. Okay? So that is, you can think of this in figure 23 too, but just flip it now. Think of my consumption having a marginal social benefit. In that case, unlike the case of cigarettes, where there's too much consumption, now there's too little consumption of landscaping services by my neighbor, because he's not accounting for the benefits to me. Okay? Yeah. Let me come to that 1 minute. Okay? Now, finally, there's one last example, which is we can have a positive production externality. And the class example of positive production externality is research and development by companies. When companies do R&D, it benefits them, but it also produces general knowledge that benefits everyone, including their competitors. As a result, if you go back to figure 23.1, my social marginal costs of doing R&D are actually lower than my private marginal costs because I'm producing benefits for other producers. It's the opposite of dumping sludge in the stream. I'm dumping knowledge in the stream. Okay? And that knowledge benefits everybody downstream. Indeed, the estimates are that $1 of R&D is worth about twice as much to society as it is to the individual firms that do it. Okay? Indeed, if you'd like to learn more about this, you can pre-order my new book, Jumpstarting America, which talks about how we're going to make America run better again by investing in public R&D. So I talk all about it. Very excited about that right now. So those are the kinds of externalities, positive and negative. Now, the question Manny asked is, so what? So these things exist. Why can't people just figure it out? Take me and my neighbor. Okay? There's an easy solution here. I just go to my neighbor and I pay him $200 or $201. He's $1 better off. I'm $299 better off. Problem solved. Indeed, there's a famous economist named Ronald Coase, who proposed that there is no such thing really as an externality, because all externalities can be internalized through private negotiation. So as long as, here's the key thing, as long as there's well-defined property rights. So in the case of my neighbor's a well-defined property right. He owns a dirt pile, so I go to him and offer him money to fix, to get rid of it. Likewise, imagine the fisherman owns the river. They could then go to the steel plant and say, we are going to charge you for dumping sludge into the river. And we'll charge you enough so that your private costs go to the social costs. Okay? So basically, Coase said, there's no problem here. There's no need for government. The private market can take care of it. Well, that's a really cute argument in theory, but in practice it breaks down. Because think about that argument for the biggest externality facing the world today, which is global warming. Okay? Global warming happens because I drive my car and people in Bangladesh drown. How are they supposed to come to me and say, John, you should drive less. I'm going to pay you to drive less so I don't drown. And that's just crazy, right? It doesn't work for big externalities. It also doesn't work for little externalities. So think about yourself. Okay, think about your neighbor playing music too loud. Class, you have a 1401 test the next day. Your neighbor's done with finals. They're partying, playing the music too loud. That's a classic negative externality on you. Now, in principle, you should say, well, I can figure out how much it's worth to me and go pay them to turn their music down. But in practice, you're not going to do that, right? You do like a social outcast. Okay? In fact, people don't work this way. There's a famous story about an economist. It can't be true, but it's a wonderful story. Who was on a plane trying to get work done. The person next to him wouldn't stop talking, so he offered them $5 to shut up. Now, that would be the Coasean solution, but in reality, life doesn't work that way. So, in fact, the private market's unlikely to solve these kinds of problems. Yeah. That's another problem. There's lots of reasons why you can't. There's no way even Coase, bless his soul, would not think that private negotiation would solve the global warming problem. There's no way. Okay, so that means we need the big bad government. We need government solutions because the private market has failed. The private market has failed because the private equilibrium is not welfare maximized. Okay, so if you go back to 22.3.1, the private market has failed because the private market overproduces steel. Therefore, there is a role for the government to potentially fix this market failure. It doesn't mean the government will. Okay, this is the key thing. I emphasize this in my course. The way to think about the logic of government involvement in the economy is in two steps. One is there a market failure? That is, will the private market fail to maximize welfare? And two is, can the government actually make it better as opposed to making it worse? So just because the private market failure doesn't mean there's a role for the government, it means there's a potential role for the government. So let's talk about theoretically what the government might do, and then practically what the government actually does do. So theoretically, the government has two options. The first option is regulation. So go into figure 23.1, the government could come in and say, hey, steel plants, we've done the math, and your optimal level of steel production is Q2. So we're going to regulate you and say you can't produce more than Q2. And if the government did that, we would get to the optimal outcome. If the government said, I'm setting a max at Q2, then we get the optimal outcome, which is Q2 would be produced. The problem with that is exactly the problem we talk about regulating monopolists, which is that requires a huge amount of government information. They need to know the shapes of the supply, they need to know the shape of the supply curve, the shape of the demand curve, and the size of the externalities. We know all three things, the supply, demand, and the size of externalities, in order to get that right. And if they get it wrong, they could lead to, if they get it too wrong, they could shut down a steel plant that's still socially valuable to have running. So we had this conversation at length with monopoly regulation, all the same problems arise. That's why economists typically prefer a simpler solution, which is taxation, or what we call in economics, corrective taxation. And this is exciting because when I taught taxes last time and the time before, taxes cause deadweight loss. Taxes cause inefficiency. But actually, in the case of externalities, taxes can reduce deadweight loss. How's that? Let's go to figure 23.3. Back to the steel market. Imagine, I don't know supply and demand curve. I just know the size of the externality. It's $100 a unit of steel. So I simply go to the steel plant and say, look, for every unit of steel you produce, I'm going to charge you $100. You do what you want. I don't know where you're going to end up, but I charge you $100. That means that the steel plant's private marginal cost curve will now align with the social marginal cost curve. You've essentially done what Coase wanted us to do. You've internalized the externalities, but done it through government action rather than private negotiation. You said, you're imposing a social cost above and beyond your private cost. We are going to essentially make you consider, it's like moving to a family utility function. We're going to make you consider all of society in your decision. We're going to make you internalize the damage you're imposing your decision. The way we're going to internalize that is by charging you for the extra cost you're imposing on society. Okay? So that is what we call corrective taxation. Okay? And corrective taxation leads to the optimal outcome. If we stay in a steel plant, for every unit you produce, we are now going to tax you by an amount MD, which is the marginal damage. Then it leads them to naturally choose point B, which is confusing because it was point C on the other graph. Okay? To choose point B, okay, or C on the other graph, which is the optimal outcome. We should change that position and make that C in the future. Which is the optimal outcome. It will cause them to choose the optimal outcome. Okay? So we've essentially got the private market to do the right thing by forcing them to internalize the externality. Much as Coase would hope to happen through private negotiation, we've caused to happen through corrective taxation. Likewise, we can think of the same thing with smoking. So go back to figure 23.2. Imagine I levied a tax of 40 cents a pack on cigarettes. Then the marginal benefit of smoking would fall by 40 cents. My willingness to pay, remember we talked to analyze taxes. When we say you have a tax that essentially shifts down the demand curve, tax on consumers, it lowers my willingness to pay. I'm only now willing to pay 40 cents less a pack because I have to pay 40 cents in tax every pack. That shifts my demand curve down such that private marginal benefit now equates to social marginal benefit. Boom. No more externalities for smoking. So here's the crazy thing. Taxes have now removed the deadweight loss. Tax haven't created a deadweight loss. Tax removes deadweight loss. So in a perfectly competitive market with no market failure, taxes create deadweight loss. But once there's market failure, taxes can actually offset deadweight loss. Okay? And that's the theoretical case for government intervention. Theoretically, the government can make things better through imposing corrective taxation. Okay? Questions about that? Yeah.
Like if somebody is really inelastic, has really inelastic consumption of cigarettes, like would the tax?
You just need a bigger tax. Yes. So basically, the way elasticity plays into it. Now, if they're totally inelastic, you'd have to learn something else. So nothing's ever perfectly. But essentially, you could take this diagram and essentially, no, I'm sorry. No, let me back up. I said that incorrectly. Elasticity doesn't matter for the actual government policy. All I want to do is impose the size of the externality. Okay? If demand's inelastic, that just means people love smoking. And as a result, you won't reduce smoking that much. But that's okay. Because basically all we care about is correcting the externality. Okay? We're not trying to punish smokers. We're not trying to achieve an optimal, and that's sort of the difference between regulation and taxation. Regulation says, no, I know what the right level of smoking is, I'm going to impose this. Taxation says, look, I don't know what the right level of smoking is. Many people freaking love smoking. Imagine there was externalities to consumption of insulin. Okay? We want to say no less insulin because we want to say no, we have to have a ton less insulin. We'd say no, we should tax people for the externalities they impose, but if they still choose to consume a lot of insulin, then they're still doing the socially optimal decision. It's a really good question because it highlights the key nature here. This is why this framework traditionally was very controversial with environmental advocates. Environmental advocates hated this framework because they called it a pollution absolution. You guys know what absolution is? It's this thing that these corrupt monks used to give before Martin Luther came along and reformed the church. Back in the 1400s, monks would come along and say, yeah, I know you sin, but if you give me like one coin or whatever, I'll say your sins were absolved. So the monks would sort of bribe people to get into heaven. Okay, it's called absolution. So for many years, this is called pollution absolution. Environmentalists hate this way to think about it. They're like, wait, you're letting people pay to get out of the damage they're doing? And the answer is, yeah. It's the right thing to do. Because in fact, if people pay and don't change their behavior, that means they just love doing that activity. And why should we penalize them just because they love doing that activity? We should penalize them to the extent they're hurting others, not care about the enjoyment they get from it. So if people, for some reason, just love smoking, let them smoke. But make them account for the damage you're doing to other people. Okay? It's a great question. Other questions? Yeah. Great question. I'm going to come back to the end of the lecture. Great question. Okay. Let me talk. That's a great segue to what I want to talk about now, which is let's move from theory to practice. Let's talk about actual government policy and what governments do and how it's informed by this kind of framework. Okay? Let's start with environmental externalities, the classic case. The classic case of negative externalities is pollution in the environment. Okay? So the environmental externalities, for example, when we produce electricity, the emissions from electricity, the sulfur and the nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide go into the air. They form particulates which get in our lungs and cause us to get sick. They cause acid rain which falls and erodes forests and buildings and things like that. And then, of course, we have global warming, which is the single biggest issue facing maybe not you, almost certainly your kids, and definitely their grandkids. Okay? Depends how long you're going to live. You guys aren't going to make it 2100. Yeah, probably not you. Like your kids when they're old and your grandkids for sure. Which is that basically the amount of fossil fuels we burn has exploded. We now, and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now the highest in at least 400,000 years. And by estimates, including from the Trump administration, this will lead to massive warming of the Earth, and that by the year 2100, global temperatures could rise as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, for those of you from North Dakota, that might not sound so bad. Even right now in Boston, might not sound so bad. Remember the great line from The Simpsons when it snows and Homer goes, hey, Lisa, there's 10 feet of global warming. But basically, the truth is, it's very bad because basically it leads to enormous rises in sea levels by as much as potentially as 3 feet. And, just think about that. That means, for example, Bangladesh is gone. Bangladesh has like 100 million people, 150 million people gone. Cape Cod gone. New York City largely gone. Florida gone. Okay? Basically, America becomes the sort of Midwest. Okay? Basically, essentially, you've got, and to put in economic terms, the Trump administration's calculations suggest the U.S. will be 10% poorer by 2100. as a result of global warming. Okay, this is real. The consequences are real, but it's a class externality because it's the ultimate externality because every single time you drive, you contribute to it, and every single time someone in Australia drives, they contribute to it because it all just goes in the air and mixes together and creates one level of global warming. So it's a completely global externality. Any pollution of emissions anywhere has the same effect. And the effect is very distant in space. So if you're in Minnesota, the effect is not nearly as bad as you're in Bangladesh. It's distant in time because the effects can be way in the future, not on you. It's a classic externality because the effects clearly don't affect you. And they arise from your consumption. Yeah. Oh yeah, well, externality. The time part is what makes it a bad externality. As long as when I drive, I do not pay any extra cost for the marginal damage I'm doing to the environment, then it's an externality. It doesn't matter if it's going to affect now or the future. Okay? The bottom line is when you drive, you are slightly making the environment worse. Okay, you live in that environment, but the problem is you, particularly here in Boston, aren't going to feel necessarily the consequences of global warming, at least initially. So you're right. If you lived in your own little world, that's a great one. Remember, externalities is if you bear it. If you lived in your own little world where you drove and made your own little rain cloud like Charlie Brown, and it you covered all the consequences, then it wouldn't be an externality. But the truth is that's not true. Many people suffer the consequences. Now, yeah.
Externalities. Do you also like take into account for any of the students statistics and all
Yeah,
that?
that's great. There's a key issue of discounts. There's a ton of really deep and hard issues here. How do you think about discounting when the damages are 100 years from now? So let's say you took a standard interest rate for that. Today, interest rates are low, 3%. Well, it's still true that 100 years from now, that means damages are worth like 20% of what they're worth today. At a higher interest rate, they're worth effectively zero. We're basically saying if you have any form of discounting of any reasonable magnitude, you're basically saying your great-grandkids don't matter. Okay, today. Well, that seems sort of implausible. So there's a lot of deep work on sort of multi-generational discounting. How do we think about discounting for hazards which are way, way off in the future? Now, it turns out even with reasonable discount rates, these costs are still huge today because they're so enormous in the future. Even when we discount them back, they're still big today. But that's the kind of difficult issue that's raised. It's really exciting and interesting stuff. So what do we do? Well, in Europe, they've gone the taxation route. So a gallon of gas in France is $7. Macron has just proposed increasing the tax, and it's causing Paris to burn. Ironically, due to global warming. Typically in Europe, gasoline is many, many times more expensive in the U.S. And basically, they have carbon taxes that try to control this. But it's proved very difficult to do that in the U.S. Indeed, when Bill Clinton proposed a 3-cent tax on gasoline when he was first elected, it basically cost him the Congress. Think about that, 3 cents. That's like a daily swing in the price of gas. Okay, gas taxes are very hard to impose in the U.S. So that's why there's been a move towards away from a taxation approach towards a regulation approach. Even though regulation approaches have the other weaknesses, there's been a move towards trying to cap global emissions, trying to regulate a cap on global emissions. And this began with the first such agreement was negotiated in Kyoto in December 97. I was at that. That was pretty cool. I was part of the Clinton administration delegation that went over there, and it was crazy because basically at all these, think about how hard this is to negotiate. So let's say you're India, and you come in and you say, wait a second, let me be clear. So in 1997, of all the stuff in the air, the U.S. was responsible for about 30% of it, and the rest of the world combined was 70%. So then you came in and say, wait a second, we haven't done anything to the environment. Okay, we're ready to grow. We want our air conditioners. We want our cars. We want our. And you says now, wait a second, no, you can't have that because we screwed up the environment. Screw you. Okay, you guys screwed it up. You guys fix it. So it's a pretty hard negotiation you have to do. Plus, the costs are quite large. So it was actually pretty cool. I was there for 4 days. I slept 4 hours. In Japan, they have this cool coffee in a can that you just sort of live on. And we negotiated an agreement which was not going to solve the problem, but would slow the growth of emissions. But America was never actually willing to ratify the agreement, so it never went anywhere. Fast forward to 20 years later, to 3 years ago in Paris, we signed another climate agreement called the Paris Climate Accord, which was similar to Kyoto and that set targets that countries could meet, and was more successful that more countries participated. In Kyoto, countries like India and China didn't participate. But now most countries have participated in the Paris Agreement, limiting emissions. The U.S. in that case signed it, but now the Trump administration has backed off it, so we're not enforcing the Paris Agreement. Now, you can completely understand politically why a leader would not want to enforce an agreement like this. You're imposing pain today for the benefits of people you'll never even meet. Okay? First of all, they live in other countries by and large. Second of all, they're going to be 100 years from now. So politically, this is unbelievably challenging. But the problem is, by the time those people are drowning, it's too late. Okay? Basically, even if today, if we could suddenly stop using any fossil fuel today, which is impossible, let's say suddenly stop using any fossil fuels today, temperatures would still rise for something like 300 years before they start to fall again. Okay? So basically, this is an incredibly hard problem because the costs are super distant. The benefits of fixing are super distant. The costs are imposed today. And that's a very, very hard problem. And that's why this is probably the single biggest social problem facing the world over the next 100 years, is how do we deal with, economically the answer is easy. I mean, in terms of what to do, it's easy. You impose tax or regulation, you essentially phase out of being a fossil fuel-based economy. Okay, so theoretically there's no problem. The problem is all political, which is basically how do you get people to be willing to bear the cost in the near term that entails? And that's just an enormous challenge. Yeah. Well, that's a deep question about the nature. Essentially, there's a different equilibrium where they have more faith in the government in Europe than we do in the U.S. Maybe that's because we are settled by frontier, adventurous people who've never liked being told what to do. I don't quite know what it is. But in any case, there's just different attitudes towards government in general. And I think essentially, if you're going to deal with this, you're going to have to essentially trust, think of a social welfare function, which includes not everybody today, but everyone in the whole future with some form of discount. You've got to trust that social welfare function, which is the government. In Europe, they trust that more than in the U.S. But look, I don't want to minimize how hard this is, okay? There's enormous disagreement about how fast we should go. In fact, I was originally, one of the reasons I went to Kyoto was because the economists of the Clinton administration were opposed to how strict the Kyoto targets were. We thought it was too severe. And I actually, in 1997, was the subject, I believe, one of the very first spam attacks. I got spammed by hundreds, at that point it was enormous, of environmental activists saying how terrible I was because I didn't want to restrict emissions more. Okay? Basically, there's huge disagreement in this. But it's a topic we can't ignore. It's a critical topic. Likewise, another critical source of externalities is health externalities. Now, we talked about smoking, but there's lots of externalities. So smoking, the externalities are actually not that large. 40 cents a pack is not that large. Depends what you use secondhand smoke. Compare that to drinking. The externalities for drinking are enormous because drunk drivers kill people. Okay? Indeed, there are 13,000 deaths per year. It is politically incorrect, let me say it. That is 4 9/11s every year from people drunk driving. 400,000 people are injured every year from drunk driving. That's a classic externality. If I kill someone in my car, maybe my license will get taken away. But clearly, I'm not bearing the full cost of killing. Okay? Yeah. That's a great question. I'm trying to compress my whole course into one lecture, which is hard. But there are estimates of value of a life. Typically, we say a life's worth about $10 million. And we can talk another time about where that comes from. But basically, if you do take those valuations, the externalities from drunk driving are enormous. And yet, we have very, very low taxes on alcohol. Yeah. This is a great question. We could go all day on this. Absolutely, they are. And this is why nobody likes economists. For example, we think babies' lives aren't worth as much as your lives. Why? Because you've got more embedded human capital. You form more connections. The value of your life's worth more. Tell that to a parent of a newborn. Okay? So there's all sorts of interesting and difficult issues in valuing life. That's a whole sort of separate field. But in any case, the bottom line is, since life's valuable, okay, there is a great, there is an important externality. Now, let's come to the interesting case very top topic, which is illegal drugs. Now, let's think about cigarettes for a second. Cigarettes impose externalities, but I never said the answer was to ban cigarettes or make them illegal. I said the answer was to tax them to the extent of their externalities. So let's say we can properly measure secondhand smoke or whatever, we do it. Indeed, cigarette taxes today probably exceed any reasonable estimate of externalities. I'm one of the biggest anti-smoking advocates out there. And I would admit, cigarette taxes today, which average nationally several dollars a pack, probably exceed the externalities of smoking. Moreover, go to illegal drugs. We don't just tax them, we ban them. So recently in all states, we banned marijuana. We still ban other drugs everywhere. Why? Think about it. The framework I taught you so far does not say you should ban anything. If I love doing cocaine, they should tax me for the externalities I do. Indeed, let's go further. There aren't many externalities for most illegal drugs. Okay? Guys who do cocaine, they may get in car accidents or heroin, but they largely just kill themselves. They don't do a lot of social damage. They largely just kill themselves. Indeed, what are the externalities from illegal drugs? They come from fighting illegal drugs. It's the crime that comes because the drugs are illegal. Okay? That's the big externality from drugs. So for that reason, economists for decades have argued drugs should be legal, all drugs. But if you think about it, they should be legal and taxed. Because the externalities largely come from the fact that they're illegal. You think about all the deaths in Mexico. Think of what would happen in Mexico if drugs were legal in America. Suddenly the price would collapse, the cartels would have no money to make, and they'd break up, and there wouldn't be all these deaths in Mexico. Those deaths in Mexico are on us. It's on the U.S. consumers who demand those illegal goods from Mexico that create the demand for crime in Mexico. If drugs were legal, it wouldn't be a problem. So why not legalize drugs? Well, we only have 1 minute. So the answer is because we don't think this model applies in all circumstances. In particular, we don't think people always make rational decisions. And this framework assumes rational decisions. We think that people make mistakes. And if the mistakes are severe enough, then taxation is not the right answer. You need an outright ban. Okay? And that's why we say, look, we think that most people try illegal drugs before the time they're 18. We think that people before they're 18 don't have fully formed prefrontal cortexes, are not fully rational. They get addicted, and that has lifelong consequences. Therefore, we make the drug illegal because we think the cost of those consequences are so large that we don't want to take a chance. But that raises the whole debate we should all be having about marijuana legalization. Is that true with marijuana? The externalities of marijuana are really small. Okay? Indeed, the damage you do yourself is actually pretty small, much less than smoking. So how do we think about whether marijuana should be legal or illegal versus cocaine and heroin, and how much should be taxed? So that's the kind of set of interesting issues we raise. We talk about this. So anyway, find that more interesting, take 1441. We'll spend many lectures talking about it.